My drawing practice has been with me for a very, very, very long time. But I really, I don't really start with drawing necessarily. I really start in reading and in text. And so the recent work, and it's a part of the Infinity Drawing series, which I started working on in 2019. And this series that I just launched is called Triangle. So it's Triangle. And I'm going to just explain kind of like the format, right? So right now I'm working either on wooden panels somewhere between 16 by 24, 16 by 20, or I am working on 60-inch square pieces of paper. They're mixed media, right? And the larger format, I feel like it's performative, so that my body actions the drawing is the record of that. Okay. Now, of course, that is how that's when I look at all art. I often always think about, or I become aware, not every time, but when I become aware that I'm standing at the distance that the artist stood in the making of the thing, it's very empowering. And I would definitely say Vincent van Gogh paintings at the National Gallery of Art, his unfinished paintings, primarily irises and a portrait of a young girl. When you stand at arm's length and you realize, you're standing at the distance of Vincent van Gogh, it is very interesting. Of course, it's a mental experiment, but it's also, art to me is, it is a practice, it is performative, even though perhaps you might be the only person in the room. Okay. Anyway, so these Infinity Drawing series, basically, I hadn't worked for a very, very long time. I was designing sets and lighting, but I wasn't working in the studio for about 5 years, so that was very interesting. So in 2019, get started again. And then the most recent drawings, which over the last 3 weeks, let's say, when I'm thinking about, so of course it's called Triangle, but really the triangle, in terms of a text, it's I'm thinking, or it is about the 47th proposition in Book 1 of Euclid's geometry book. So the math that I practice, which is one of the things that I know that you're seeing in the work, comes from ratios and proportions. It's very much embedded, or the diagrams are embedded in the architectural diagrammatic drawing. And what's interesting to me about architectural diagrammatic drawing is it is a set of directions, right? It is an abstract set of directions. A line art, or these abstract, simple shapes to scale on a piece of paper eventually turns into a building, right? Imagine how that happens, and how many people, skill sets are involved, and how many people have to imagine what this drawing is directing them to do. But you can certainly, an architect isn't in the ear of every single construction worker or surveyor or plumber and electrician, you know what I mean? It's fascinating. Okay, so the origin of all of my drawing is absolutely, on one scale, it's about architectural diagrammatic drawing, thinking about scale, proportions, and ratios. And then the other portion of it is early modernist, constructivist aesthetics, and the elemental, the reduction down of ideas and form. And in this case, in Russia, right, it would have been for the illiterate serfs who had just been liberated from the Tsar in 1918. Okay, so there's definitely primariness, definitely always elements of things. I'm not interested in flourishes, or highly decorated things, even though I could do that if I wanted to or whatever. But just that's not what this work is about. The work intersects language. It is also organized through semiotics. So what is semiotics, right? So semiotics is the understanding. It is a methodology of how perceptual experience gets translated into a memory, which then can be recalled, and it turns into something. It turns into an image, and then that image can be shared through language. Okay, And straight out communication theory. Yeah. So again, music, math, and patterns. And in any type of recognizing a pattern, right? I need to, or we have to sort of be present, right? And perhaps it's based on senses and perception, right? And pattern recognition, again, is an elemental, little children, a 7-month-old, right? A 7-month-old realizes, oh, here's this shape or, milk bottle coming to my mouth, and mom, these two amorphous people with this 5-shaped oval, right, is coming again, and my stomach's going to feel better after they hold me, and care for me anyway. This is all pattern recognition, right? Now, in terms of, let's say, the origins of epistemology, the origins of realizing our direct experiences can give us a certain amount of knowledge, something that is, or recognition of patterns, right? I've paid a lot of attention to, read about Anaximander. So Anaximander, pre-Socratic philosopher in Greece. Again, this is, it's so interesting to distinguish pre-Socratic, post-Socratic, right, or Socratic. Basically, folks that pay attention to patterns were observing the heavens, observing celestial patterns, obviously the way the sun moves throughout the day and the earth turns around over a year, et cetera, et cetera. And Anaximander realized, wow, these patterns I'm observing, I can turn them into models, and therefore they become, I can't make a model of the full universe, but I can make an amilari, right, a model of what I understand the patterns of the planets and the stars and the earth to be. And then all of a sudden we have this, I can share it, right? So it's easier to share the pattern I'm seeing, right, in this model. And it's really quite beautiful, and it's considered to be the origins of the first architectural thinking. Okay, and in fact, architecture up until 1870s, roughly, architecture was embodied that celestial relationship. It embodied a conversation around the presence of forces larger than human beings. Right? I would call them nature. Other people call them gods. Doesn't matter. But they were. Architecture was considered, certainly public, civic architecture, is considered to be identifying and sharing and creating community, right, in relationship to larger forces. And so in addition to the amilari, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, it's okay, he also recognized that a map, right, would be another way to describe, these patterns and forces. And the map that I love is in Book 18 of the Homer's Iliad, where Achilles, so Hephaestus, the god Hephaestus is going to forge, right, create, articulate a shield for Achilles because he's lost his armor for the Trojan War. And in the story, basically the shield is one side it's civic situations that are pleasant and harmonious. On the other side, it is civic situations that are the exact opposite. So again, this kind of symbolic thinking, the logic is of Achilles now is the weapon, the shield, the weapons become this, and my actions behind it or with it it moves up symbolically through civic relationships and again relationships to forces. And then the last object is the gnomon, so a sundial, right? And of course the Egyptians had them, and again. Anaximander isn't saying I'm inventing a gnomon, but he of course starts to focus on is a sundial, a gnomon, right? This vertical thing perpendicular to the ground helps us predict seasons and gives us a sense of times of day, and it helps us organize our life. It's really powerful and very, very interesting. So math, patterns, music. The most recent drawings, and obviously you can pull down the things from Instagram. So you'll know they're like, there's a negative space of a triangle, and then there's 3 legs that taper. They're kind of tapering, right? And that tapering shape and the 3-sided shape is something I've been working in since 18, 20 years old, right? And I think of it as, I'm bending. So these are flat pieces of paper that then I fold on the picture, and they remind me of legs, or they remind me of things in motion, right? But and the ambiguity of a machine-made thing and its human characteristics, and it's in that dialogue, okay? So again, representation, right, of knowledge. What the origins of the Triangle series is about is I just finished reading the book Overstory by Richard Powers, and it was published in 2018, and it's a very, very, very interesting novel, right? It's a narrative around just the crisis of climate change, the crisis of removing our overstory, and then the kind of how it implicates our daily lives. It's a beautiful story, very, very interesting. But in his description of the overstory and how a tree grows, I realized that my visual, my index of familiar shapes that I go to all the time, right? We would call them our inventories. And I have about 100 shapes that I go to all the time. That I started to see how this triangle shape, these legs, I could start creating experiences of what it would be like to lying on the ground and looking up at branches in a tree. Okay? And so, as you know, last fall in my Likely Stories installation, and what I was thinking about, again, like through the eyes of an axe mender, was if there are ways to share with human beings what makes a tree, the importance of a tree, understand its systems, which last year was about systems, then hopefully people can allow to expand the implications of why trees are important to us, right, in our habitat. And again, the fall of 2021, that was just really kind of like the beginning point, and I didn't necessarily, I was going to use the time that I had, roughly the 3 months I had, just to explore these ways of how do I make a model, what's shareable, about all these kinds of things. I think it was very successful. But now the triangle structure, I think, is more, what's probably more interesting to look at, kind of more mesmerizing, and now I'm changing the plane, right? And in fact, the other interesting concept to me, again, a Greek concept called parabasis. And parabasis is when in a Greek play, the chorus at a certain point, or maybe several points, the chorus turns to the audience and suspends the narrative, and turns to the audience to talk to them about whatever, right? Now, I create wedges, I'm interested in disruption, right? And, in other words, not trying to, really not intentionally I want to make anyone uncomfortable. That's not what it's about. It's about, I think, parabasis in an interesting way is just about consciousness. And so in disruption, this kind of storytelling, you allow people maybe to unconsciously start to process what the play's about, right? You allow everyone to, maybe it's really intentional, everyone to take a step back. It's a way to change rhetorics, right? You might start telling jokes or talk about the weather or, the next ceremony we're going to do or something. And, in the Greek sense. And then you go back, right? So in theater, it's the fourth wall, right? So Bertolt Brecht was super, his use of breaking the proscenium plane wall was to certainly recognize that the play and the people in the audience, they're part of this enterprise. It is not simply entertainment, right? We're in this together. there are many messages here, civic messages, blah, blah, blah. And anyway, but it was very creative and innovative. So the most important thing to me about the triangle drawings is that instead of just diagramming, typically that diagrammatic, abstract place, I'm not placing anything. I'm to shift it to be able to create this one-point perspective in this direction is interesting to me. Okay.
Wow. Okay. So much kind of came up for me. So one, I really liked how you talked about. There was this time during architecture where the goal was to leave room for to interact with other energies, other forces. And I know one way I'd heard in a philosophy class somewhere deep back in under, they were talking about the lighting and how it was leaving room for divine. And, and so
well, it's symbolic representation of the divine, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I just wonder though, as we've gotten to this world, what came up for me while you're talking, in this world where everything is extremely literal and like captured in some what seems like exact way, because a picture isn't really exact.
No, it's an image.
It's an image.
I mean,
and it's lighting and everything.
Yeah.
But when we have that, everything is like kind of so literal. It's like, how do we protect and keep the precious of what that was? Like at the base of everything is this leaving room for your muse or whatever to interact. So I wonder if that's played a part. I'll just guide it to where I'm thinking. I wonder if that's played a part in when you talk about your work. You have such a confidence and just an approach that says we're not questioning at base level, should I be looking at shapes? We're really talking about how can I use it to express, like you said, maybe where I'm standing in relation to the work, things that I'm working on that I don't even know about. I tend to think when we create.
Totally.
And so how do we get from this point where we're thinking, where someone is trying to get to the point where they have that, from the child that just is like inclined to shapes or doodling on their paper. They seem like they could be a million miles apart, although it feels like it could be along the same trajectory.
Absolutely. In fact, so this other book I just finished reading was about magicians in time. And it actually I'm reading two texts right now. One is Whitehead's Lectures of Trinity College Around Nature, where he's distinguishing man's thinking around nature versus what nature is, which is outside of man's domain. It's very, you could argue philosophy of 1919 is not that significant today, but what Whitehead is demonstrating is creating how we can create as helpful definitions to things to help us constrain and not get caught up in let's say tautologies that don't produce any, that aren't shareable. All right. Now, and it's really interesting to me. And again, it helps me think about my diagrams. But the Magicians in Time, I think that's the name of the book. But whatever, it's discussing between 1919 and 1929. Of course, we have to remember it's the end of World War II. It's in the middle of the Spanish flu. It's tremendous inflation during the Weimar period, and Germany is trying out democracy, right? And anyway, again, it parallels our time right now in terms of disruption, uncertainty, things out of control. And so we have Cassirer, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Walter Benjamin, all right? These are 4 points of view, but they're all addressing the same point of view, which is where does meaning occur, okay? Cassirer thinks idyllically, he is mining symbolism, Renaissance symbolism, right? Totally using paintings and Renaissance ephemera as a text of the universals, right? Of exactly what you just talked about, little kids scribbling. But the other 3 are basically, and so Cassirer is thinking about infinity, right? Universals, right? But the other 3 men are thinking about constraints, about finitude, removing transcendence and moral things. Now Kant is at the foundation of this, and we don't have to go into that. And of course, Ebony's going, Lori, why do you spend all this time on these silly little books? Philosophy simply is a conversation that's been sustained for an extremely long time around our consciousness, about recognizing I have a conscious, and then what is it, right? And to me, the most elegant description of that is Genesis, book 1 of Genesis in the Bible. Okay, everyone can look that up on your own, but it's beautiful. And anyway, so Wittgenstein takes the most severe, simple. Wittgenstein, Benjamin, and Heidegger have experienced tremendous loss in their life, and loss is the mechanism that is driving their consciousness. Okay, and of course it's that tension. Loss is loss. It can't come back. But how might it help me? That's what they're kind of asking these questions, and all of them arrive at language. How is language a tool for us to understand what it is that we're sensing, and then thinking about how much is shareable with other people? So this gets me to your point exactly. And Wittgenstein especially says most of our talking is nonsense, but we must pay attention to our nonsense. So when we look at a young child's doodles, whatever they're up to, however they're expressing themselves, we should just say, what is this nonsense? And it's a demonstration of their consciousness, period. And it means certainly the act of whatever it is they're up to, it means something to that human being, right? Yeah. And then if there's a way for anyone to engage with that action, what's going on here, right? Have a conversation. It's important.
You talk about thank you, that's really, I think that's going to be helpful, and it's the seed planted in terms of how to handle, like educators can take that, folks in that primary, I don't know, kindergarten to 5th grade can take that and build lesson plans around how to react to that, as opposed to I'm coming to it with my own text and my own pre-lesson plan.
Yeah, the kind of top down the real art of teaching is that I think you disengage from outcomes. You are participating in learning. You're facilitating learning. It's not what you know. It's what you want to share with others. And then and that however many human beings are in the room, they're going to have that many points of view. And then you get them to begin to share their points of view. And then then the conversation, the community gets built. And then you realize, well, what holds up, what everyone's being intuitive at the beginning of anything, but then what holds up over the discussion, over time, over using these things, and then you can recognize, well, this is something that has value, and then how might we use this something, right, into the next thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You said some things also while you were talking just about in creating, but also specifically in shapes and the patterns. You talked about some things that might be being accomplished, or at least we can think about. So you talked about body movement and how what you create is kind of the what is left evidence of maybe the movement your body made.
Exactly.
And so it talks about relationships that people have to their bodies and what you're doing, a consciousness that you spoke of. You talked about communication. It's a way of communicating things forward, even that it's a primariness. So is there too soon to begin to explore the shape and things like that, or is there something in the primariness of what's being created in creating a shape? So let me translate it into English. When I was my first year of undergrad, they had us create a circle. Like that was the first.
Now, were you in a drawing class? Okay, beautiful. Totally. Yeah.
And they just wanted us to explore the circle. I thought, this is so weird, but it raised my consciousness of a circle. And then just everything after that became through the lens of this really honed. It's like if you were to get your brakes done on your car, your brakes are good, right? Like everything is really tight around your brakes. So it felt like everything that was symmetrical and round came into a full view. So space was created
Yeah.
there by doing that. And I wonder how that translates to a classroom environment or even a home environment.
Well, so the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, whose name I can't remember right now, he would translate your thinking. His concept would be quality. Okay, Plato would translate your thought as virtue, or Socrates. Well, Plato is recording Socrates, but Socrates' concept of virtue, that would be the same thing. So in other words, of course, in the discipline of drawing, the circle becomes the way in which you understand, right? That symmetry, that balance, that harmony, and all of its connections, as you very clearly just stated. All right? So it's in, there's so many ways I don't want to talk about it in terms of kind of like a competition but a real, there are real skills that we learn in the world, right? Walking, talking, and the skill of drawing, and drawing, the awareness of drawing isn't just in making a perfect circle. It's exactly how you described it. All of a sudden, that circle turns into a sphere, it turns into a bulb, it turns into a face, it turns into all these things, right? And there's an integrity about that.
Okay, that's awesome. I'm rolling that around. You talked about it being language, a way to just even create a language, the zeros and ones.
Yeah,
something
right.
you worked on.
So language to me is a I'm not quite sure if we should be using that term anymore, that concept anymore. It really confuses me. I understand language when we're talking about the way in which mental pictures get transcribed as a oral communication and written communication. But then there are artists that would use the language of textiles, right? And I'm like, all of a sudden, you're using this term language where we communicate with, and now you're talking about it in a specific discipline that I don't have any knowledge of.
Yeah, that happens. I'm noticing in the equity conversations it's coming up. So we're using accessibility, but that used to be reserved for like 508 compliance and someone that is a non-sighted user, and we're flipping it on its head. And there's a few of those times.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
So again, Wittgenstein would tell you that it's a toolbox, right? The elements and principles of language, right, are sounds and abstract shape or symbolic shapes that get arranged as sounds and as sounds joined together, and then those sounds get translated into some alphabet, which are just completely abstract symbols, and that through practice we pick up on the pattern of how to use it, how to use the toolbox of language.
So a child that may be, let's say, autistic children or sometimes not nonverbal, could there be activities around creating shapes or exploring?
Well, so here we get into particularity of neurodiversity, and it would be by case, right? And it's my understanding that oftentimes a child in the autistic spectrum, the sense of sounds, right? It's just they receive them too greatly, right? It's too stimulating, But so I would ask the question: what is this person's communication toolbox? Right? Now I have a friend who has a Down syndrome baby. And the physical limitations of a child with that is their muscles are delayed. Just the muscular things, and that includes the tongue and the mouth, shaping the mouth and all these things. And this child has maybe close to 200 sign language things, and and I communicate with her. And there's no doubt in my mind that this child understands communication. It's just different, right? And of course, fundamentally, what is American Sign Language? Think about what is fundamentally the toolbox of American Sign Language, and then where it intersects the language abstractions, and ultimately it is a received sense of elemental actions, okay, using the body in this case, right, and how it's expressed that communicates a state of point of view, and that it requires at least two people to understand the pattern. It's beautiful.
Oh, I love what you just said. At least two people, the person communicating it and one person to receive it. Because we have this sort of mainstream sort of approach to things.
Yeah.
If it should be universal to all. It should immediately be.
It's very modern. It's a very arrogant modernist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wonder how we will grow after this. Will we go to?
Well, this is what makes artificial intelligence and augmented reality or technology, these technology tools that we have. We're almost cyborgs now, right? So interesting, and because in essence, in terms of our modeling, right? So instead of a sphere of the planets, right now this phone models our consciousness. Is a model of consciousness. How about that? Right? Yeah.
And is it, I don't want to say, is it dangerous to rely sometimes on something to capture? Because we begin to rely on it to communicate our consciousness. If there's no emoji for this, I can't communicate this feeling. Mm-hmm. And so when do we, what is that balance?
It is, I am not interested in this space to be a reflection or help me cogitate. I use it all the time. It helps me spell. It helps me look up topics that I want to look up or whatever, right? It's a wonderful tool, but it is not my identity, and it is not human contact, okay? But to say that, anyone born after 2000, this is their life, right? And it's okay for me to say, I'm not quite sure how interested in I am in it. However, there are, we just need to turn to the folks that really are embracing it and have a discussion with them.
I mean, what comes up for me when you say that is that we are in this world where they feel like we can create tablets and provide tablets and computers to students, and that should bridge a lot of the inequities in terms of who can access lessons.
Yeah.
But I think what you just said is like, why don't we use the computer or the tablet as a way to still express, again, full circle, right? We're the buildings, we're leaving room for divine or some otherness. Mm-hmm. Why not let the tablet create room for that student to create, create circles.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Exactly. Definitely the opportunities to practice communication in addition to oral and written communication in a tablet has barely been touched. So I totally agree with you. All right?
Well, that's what we're up to. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Doing this deep dive. Wow, I can't wait to see what more comes up.
Well, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. And congratulations. It's such an interesting series.